Welcome to a special edition of Legal AF. We like to bring on a whole host of people to talk directly to our audience and brief them about things that matter at the intersection of law and politics. I've got a fascinating issue here that's at the forefront of really thought, what's going on in law schools, what's going on outside of law schools, and just in life, which is the aging of America. We just got through an older president aging in place in the White House. We currently have a president who's whatever that is, he's aging in place in America in the White House. And of course, we've got other things like just the overall graying of America. Yet we have policies and laws and other systems that are really arranged for a much younger group of Americans. Just the life cycle has changed completely, but has the law and these institutions changed with it? And there's a great new book out about law and the 100-year life published by Cambridge, which is filled with different people, professors in different disciplines coming together to think about their particular disciplines as America ages and what it means for their particular study. And I thought the way to kick this off was to have Professor Abbe Gluck and Professor Jamal Greene join us. Abbe is one of the editors of the book and Jamal a major contributor to it. And we're going to kick this conversation off for our audience about should there be a constitutional right to age and to age with dignity? Welcome, Professor Gluck and Professor Greene.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, we're excited. Audience is excited. So, Abbe, you and I were kibitzing a little bit before we got started. As one of the editors, you want to talk about the overall book's premise and when people, and we're putting notes below for our audience so they can grab even free copies. You can talk about that, about how the chapters are divided. And then let's you and I and Professor Greene dive right in to the thought bubble that I started with, which is constitutional right to age.
Thanks so much. So everywhere you look right now, people are talking about longevity. Books about wellness are everywhere. The aging population is everywhere. By 2050, the number of elderly people in this country will equal the population of the state of Connecticut. So we're looking at, a major demographic change in our society. So what we decided to do is something that we've never done before at my center at the law school when we think about health and policy issues. We decided to solicit the brightest minds from people from across fields, whether immigration, prisons, health, education, constitutional law, transportation, people who have nothing to do with aging policy, and ask those experts to think about what are the major challenges their field is going to face if they have a society of 100-year-old Americans, and what might be the opportunities, exciting opportunities for change and policy reform. And the result of this fantastic book, which you're helping us promote, which is actually free from Cambridge, it's open access, or you can pay us for it. That would be fine too. But it really spans a ton of issues. I know we're not going to talk about them all today, but it's politics, it's family law, it's healthcare, it's long-term care, it's trust in estates, how you devise your will, right? It's all of those things. And it's really fascinating things you might not be thinking about, like climate change, right? Climate change and the older Americans. So there's so much to talk about, and we really appreciate being here to talk about it with you.
Absolutely. And for those that are just catching up, Professor Gluck is at Yale, and Professor Greene is a constitutional law expert at Columbia. So why don't let's kick it off? Should there be, and why do we need, I guess is the question, and do we need an actual amendment to the Constitution to guarantee not just happiness and the pursuit of happiness and whatever else is whatever else had been in the Constitution, at least as interpreted, do we need one to protect people's aging and the dignity around aging? I mean, we're watching an administration that's not being very good about the dignity part of aging, not with the cuts that they've been making to social programs. You never hear this president, even though he is old, talk about these kind of issues out loud. So we don't have an ambassador for these issues in the White House, although we should. So how do we protect the American people? Do we need that constitutional amendment?
Well, I think the first question to ask about this is what would it even mean to have a right to age or a right to grow old? And when I talk about that, and when I thought about it for the chapter, it's not, do you have a right to not have the state kill you or something like that? It's how do you grow old with dignity, and what are the kinds of things that people need to do that? whether it's elder care or access to it, whether it's expansion in social programs like Social Security, like Medicare, whether it is some kind of broader redistribution of income. Now, we don't tend to think of those kinds of things in terms of rights in the United States. And you ask, should there be a constitutional amendment? Well, the usual way in the US that we get rights to things is not really through amendments. We never amend our Constitution. It's really through development over time of broader rights, rights to equality, rights to liberty, and so forth. And so the question is, are there ways of thinking about rights to the basic needs to live a dignified life that can be thought of in the ways that we're used to thinking about constitutional rights? And that's kind of the way I've tried to approach this chapter. If you're in constitutional law, there's a pretty famous case. It's called DeShaney versus Winnebago County, but it's a case from the 1980s about a severely disabled child who gets disabled because his father severely abuses him. And the question that the court asked in that case is, was there a right to not be attacked by your father? And the court says no. And that case has been sort of stood for the idea that you don't have a right for the state to give you things, right? You have a right to not have the state do things to you, but you don't have a right to get things from the state. I think that when we think about aging, we think about the fact that everyone gets old. That's actually those are the kinds of benefits that we're all going to need at some point. And so when we think about the kind of political economy of certain constitutional rights, what is the likelihood that the public's going to buy into this kind of right? What's the likelihood that judges are going to understand this kind of right? When we're thinking about aging, it's maybe in a different category than a lot of other kind of positive rights to benefits.
I mean, if I could jump in here,
Yes,
I think Jamal's chapter is absolutely brilliant, and he really delves deeply into the doctrine. I want to take a sort of a broader view from the perspective of the book as a whole to sort of give it a little more context. So one thing to keep in mind is that even though the U.S. Constitution doesn't give positive rights, a lot of states give positive rights, right to housing, right to education. So one thing to think about is there a role for the states here to start guaranteeing some basic level of a dignified life? The other thing that permeates the book that has a constitutional right flavor, but isn't a constitutional amendment discussion per se, is virtually every chapter of the book resonates with the same theme of inequalities, whether it's an inequality between the old and the young or inequalities within different kinds of old people. Right. So one of the chapters is on education, for example, and there's a lot of data that shows that disparities in education at a young age affect how long you live and how healthy you are far down the line. There's another chapter about family law, which talks about how family formation in elderly people looks kind of different than it does people who get married, right? These are second, third marriages. Some people don't want to get married again a second or third time at the age of 80. Minority populations are much more likely to be in untraditional family formations. But family law, including Social Security law, tax law, they privilege those traditional family structures. And so they disadvantage these older person family formations. Similarly, we have a complete lack of investment in the aging population. And a really interesting statistic is that after World War II, with the baby boom, the number of pediatricians exploded in the United States. Medical schools and hospitals invested in pediatrics. Geriatrics, it's a dying, no pun intended, right? There are a dying breed. We cannot get people to be geriatricians. We are not investing in chronic disease. We are not even thinking about public transportation when a really important policy topic that's almost everywhere these days is taking elderly people's driver's licenses away, right? Yeah. Everywhere people are talking about autonomy and older people driving, but have we thought, what are we going to do to incentivize older people not to drive and still make them feel that they are independent? And our chapter on transportation talks about that in a really interesting way. So there's a really broad way to think about these kinds of rights and the kinds of structures that need to be in place to ensure an equal lifespan.
I like the idea of states and state constitutions and referendums trying to address dignity and aging, because I just don't have the confidence, and maybe Professor Greene will debate me on this. I just don't have the confidence that this United States Supreme Court majority is going to be inventing new freedoms and new liberties and new dignity freedoms in the Constitution as they interpret it.
Well, I'll say two things about that. So one is, yeah, I mean, I'm not naive. I know the court that we have, but I'm thinking about this as many professors do 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, not tomorrow. But the other, I think, really important thing to note is when we think about rights and we think about how rights are protected through constitutions, it's not just, does the court invent the right or does the court recognize the right? It's also, does the court step back when other institutions recognize rights? And a really important, I think, point when we talk about the right to certain kinds of benefits from the government is a lot of this is going to happen through Congress, is going to happen through state governments as well. And people whose interests are not, whose financial interests might be affected, people who don't like to be taxed on things, right? They're going to bring lawsuits. And the question is not just, do you recognize the right, but do you recognize the right of governments to recognize the right? So if Congress passes a law of Social Security or Medicare, right? One way of thinking about that is that's Congress recognizing the rights of people to grow old with dignity. And so it's a smaller lift, I think, to say, defer to Congress than it is to say invent this right or recognize this right.
Yeah, I agree with you. Plus, it incentivizes our audience to get motivated for elections and even at the midterm, because the quicker we get the people in there that will find your argument compelling, the better. I mean, right now, we've got an administration that spends a fair amount of time trying to figure out how to cut the social safety net and how to cut the umbilical cord or the fuel line between the American people and the federal government. But that's not a permanent condition, right? That can change with a change in administration and a change in Congress.
No, that's absolutely right. And, it's important to think in the long term. And it's also, again, we all get old, right? That's there's only so many things that you can't prevent happening. And one of them is getting old. And so there will be political constituencies for the kinds of support that we're talking about. And that's going to translate into policy reform through the election process, not just through courts. And those different kinds of institutions can work together to protect constitutional rights.
Look, one thing to think about, look historically back, 1965, Medicare's passed, major healthcare legislation to ensure the elderly population, right? That's an example of a successful intervention by Congress, right? That helps ensure a more dignified life. More recently, under the Biden administration, the Inflation Reduction Act managed to lower prescription drug costs under the Medicare program. The Biden administration also had a nursing home staffing rule that was designed to raise the quality of the nursing home experience. That has been, taken away by the current administration. But we have examples time and again of Congress intervening. The Affordable Care Act itself had an entire title that attempted to implement a long-term care program for all of us. It required a sort of a fiscal balancing act that the numbers didn't add up, and the act of that title effectively sunset. But there was an attempt by then Senator Kennedy to try to enter the conversation by saying there's some kind of national right to have long-term care so that your mother, your child, your daughter, your sister isn't stuck caring for the aging population in the household.
I tell our listeners, if you ever want to know what the Great Society looked like, go to the President Johnson Presidential Library in Austin, Texas, and walk through the whole section. And if you don't know your history well, you'll just be like, he did that? All of that? All of that came out of President Johnson in one term. So it does show you that we can, even though we're suffering, for many of us suffering through this current term, which can't end fast enough. But there is maybe not Supreme Court precedent, doesn't get changed overnight except recently, but we certainly can make a major difference in social policy with the change in election and leadership in the White House.
It's not politically driven. Look, President Nixon passed the HMO Act, right? And during his administration, President Nixon had a brother who died young of cancer, a sick brother. He was influenced by his biography. George Bush, the first one, is the president who, the second George Bush is the one who passed Medicare Part D, which was the first time that Medicare included prescription drug coverage. Okay, so it's not necessarily the case that there has to be one administration or another. There have been important congressional interventions over time that all have made inroads into this idea. But what we're trying to get at here is that it's more than just healthcare. Right? I do healthcare for a living. One of my goals with the book was saying, let's get beyond healthcare and let's think about all the institutions across our society. Like I mentioned, the transportation system, the housing system, prison system, right? Think about what that means. Do you want to have a population aging in prison? Right? So those are my questions. Go ahead.
Sorry, Abby. One of the current statutory levers for this that could certainly be expanded is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was enacted under the first President Bush, right? So just to speak to Abby's point about politics.
So make age a disability, so to speak.
Well,
under the act,
it's a statute that recognizes that sometimes the government has to accommodate people and meet them where they are, and that's something that's certainly relevant to the aging population.
Yeah, well. I mean, I had it on a personal level. All the things that we've talked about. I lost my mom 3 months ago, and I had her in an assisted living facility. I had to encourage her to give up her driver's license at some point, but I had to have a substitute for her in place of the driver's license and have that, on a personal, anecdotal level. And then I remember, because I had an aging parent who I was close with, and I've gone through that life cycle with her. I remember there was a study several years ago where they took young people and put them into a bodysuit of what would be like if they were 80 or 90 in terms of their gait, in terms of what their vision would look like. They put goggles on them, with the equivalent of not cataracts, but and to give them a whole new understanding in their 20s and 30s of what it means to be them in their 80s and 90s. And I always thought about that study when working with my mom.
It's interesting. One of the chapters in her book, written by another constitutional law scholar, Kenji Yoshino, talks about an experiment where you're given an avatar, that ages you. So that the idea of seeing yourself older is supposed to sort of reconnect the cognitive dissonance. Like people today can't imagine themselves older, and they can't imagine the kinds of rights or can't get motivated to think about the future because they're not thinking about it as affecting themselves, even though, as Jamal said, we're all going to get old. And these experiments that he's discussing about the effectiveness of getting people to actually see themselves older or sort of break this sort of denial that most people have that they're going to be in this situation can be very effective in developing rights.
Are you able, both of you, to bring some of this study, some of this analysis into your classrooms and in real time with this generation of students that you have? Or is this more of a long view scholarship that you're doing and sharing with our audience?
Well, I'm always reluctant to bring my scholarship directly into the classroom. There's so many other things to talk about, but I do think a lot about different ways of thinking about the rights that we have, and different ways of thinking about constitutional rights, different ways of recognizing and realizing those rights, different kinds of remedies that courts can offer that are maybe a little bit less coercive, but a little bit broader. And so this is very much in line with other thinking that I've done about how to think more broadly about constitutional rights.
In addition to the book, the Law and the 100-Year Life, which is now out on Cambridge Press and publishing, and we'll put the links there and put up the book jacket again for people that are interested in seeing all of the contributors, and we'll have others join our show. Are there institutions or societies or organizations in America that are thinking deeply about these issues on a daily basis, as not just a one-off book, but are there groups that are lobbying at the state level and the federal level? Not just AARP, of course. I mean, we know that one, but are there deep thinkers and institutes thinking about these issues for the American people?
I mean, there are a lot of books that are coming out. Zeke Emanuel, one of the most prominent health policy analysts in the country, has a new book coming out on wellness and aging. There are a host of stakeholder organizations that focus on healthcare and Medicare and Medicaid that are lobbying for example, insurance coverage for assisted living, right? Right now, nursing homes get covered
Yeah, I know.
spending money, but assisted living doesn't. And a lot of people need to start in assisted
Yeah.
living. It's a spectrum. People
Yeah.
age into these institutions, and we don't have coverage for assisted living.
My mother was 90. She never got to nursing. She was always in assisted living for 10 years.
It's expensive for you.
Yeah, well, right.
Right, or for her. Right, that's
Yeah.
expensive. You don't have that kind of federal assistance unless you spend down all your income. So you get into a situation where there are plenty of stakeholder groups in the healthcare space that have been thinking of this as a topic of insurance coverage, right? And thinking about it as the burdens on the caregiving generation. But I think what we don't have, and someone could please correct me if I'm wrong, and there's a growing literature on gerontocracy, which I know you're going to be talking about in another segment, the power of the old in politics. But across these other fields, there is less thought in a concerted way across the housing field, the transportation field, the criminal justice system field, the environmental field about this aging population. It's inevitable that it's going to come, but there isn't the same kind of attention, I think, that we have as a natural matter in the healthcare context, because aging has been thought to be wrapped up in healthcare. And one of the things we're trying to do here is break it out and show that it really permeates all sectors.
And map aging onto all these different sectors of society. And I think that's the beauty of your book. I encourage everybody in our audience, if they that have enjoyed this briefing, to pick up Law in the 100-Year Life. Links below to get that. And today we were joined by Professor Abbe Gluck of Yale and Professor Jamal Greene of Columbia. Thank you for joining our Legal AF audience and briefing them on these issues.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm Michael Popok, and I got some big news for our audience. Most of you know me as the co-founder of Midas Touch's Legal AF and the Legal AF YouTube channel, or as a 35-year national trial lawyer. Now, building on what we started together on Legal AF, I've launched a new law firm, the Popok Firm, dedicated to obtaining justice through compassionate and zealous legal representation. At the Popok Firm, we are focused on obtaining justice for those who have been injured or damaged by a life-altering event by securing the highest dollar recoveries. I've been tirelessly fighting for justice for the last 35 years, so my own law firm organically building on my Legal AF work just feels right. And I've handpicked a team of top-tier trial fighters and settlement experts throughout all 50 states known as big auto injury attorneys who have the know-how to beat heartless insurance companies, corporations, government entities, and their attorneys. Big Auto's attorneys working with my firm are rock stars in their respective states and collectively responsible for billions of dollars in recoveries. So if you or a loved one have been on the wrong side of a catastrophic auto, motor vehicle, rideshare, or truck accident, suffered a personal injury, or been the victim of medical malpractice, employment harassment or discrimination, or suffered a violation of your civil and constitutional rights, then contact the Popok Firm today at 1-877-POPOK-AF or by visiting my website at www.thepopokfirm.com and fill out a free case evaluation form. And if we determine that you have a case and you sign with us, we don't get paid unless you do. The Popok Firm, fighting for your justice every step of the way.